welcome to the second in our series this term of Mansfield Talks. We're very pleased that you're here. This was intended to be the first talk in the term because I think free speech on campus is a very important issue, but we squeezed in Alida Black talking about Eleanor Roosevelt as a starter. So I'm incredibly pleased today to have and to welcome Corrie Stoughton here, who is the Advocacy Director at Liberty. She is actually also at the moment the Acting Director of Liberty, so she has the whole ship on her shoulders. And so she's in charge of the legal policy and campaigning work at Liberty. Before that, she was Senior Counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the US Department of Justice under President Obama. So we can all be very jealous of a very interesting job at a very interesting and optimistic time in US policy. And she has also worked at the American Civil Liberties Union on a range of constitutional and human rights issues there. She was originally educated at Harvard and in Michigan, or in fact in Michigan and in Harvard. And so when she moved to the UK, she joined Liberty to keep going with the work that she is so committed to. Free speech on campus is obviously an extremely controversial and topical issue, and I'm very pleased to have Corrie giving this talk. She's going to speak, I think, for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a chat, and then any questions that you want to ask, we'll have time for that too. So, Corrie, thank you very much.
Thanks. The internet says it should be 40 minutes, but I talk too fast, so it might even be a little bit shorter than that. Thanks, Helen, so much, and to the Bonavera Institute for the invitation to speak today. And thank you especially to the students here for giving up a precious Friday evening to be here. I wish I'd been the sort of university student who went to lectures about free speech on campus when I was at university, but I wasn't quite so intellectually focused back then. Although I'm sure on many Fridays you could have found me exercising my right to free speech, if perhaps a little too loudly. I want to start with a couple of stories. The first, in 1966, Stokely Carmichael, in October of 1966, he was the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a leader of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, gave a speech on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley, I should say. The university had faced enormous pressure to cancel his speech from, among others, Ronald Reagan, who was then the governor of California. But in his speech, which went forward, Carmichael reminded his audience that the struggle for free speech on campus amounted to a struggle over whether or not black people will have the right to use the words they want without white people giving their sanction. Fast forward now 50 years. In February of 2017, Milo Yiannopoulos, a right-wing professional internet troll, was scheduled to give a speech at Berkeley. Again, the university resisted calls from prominent voices to cancel the event. On the day Yiannopoulos' speech was to take place, violence spun off from a large counter-protest. People hurled metal police barricades through the plate glass window of the Berkeley Student Center, and someone set fire to a media outlet's lighting rig. In fact, a masked protester pepper sprayed a fellow student protester while she was being interviewed by a local television news crew. Amidst all this chaos, police evacuated Yiannopoulos from campus. The event's cancellation triggered an absolute solid, nonstop week of national media outrage and protests against Berkeley, including a tweet from President Trump threatening to cut off the university's federal funding. Now, Milo Yiannopoulos doesn't deserve to be spoken about in the same breath as Stokely Carmichael. Their speech is not of equivalent value. But you have to know both of these stories, I think, to really think clearly about the topic of free speech on campus. Who gets to decide who speaks on university campuses? Before answering that question, it's worth reminding ourselves why that's a free speech issue at all. After all, there's no right to speak at a university. I have no right to walk onto campus and commandeer this podium. I was invited, and it's a great privilege. But I have no legal or moral claim on the university to extend that invitation to me. My hosts are free to impose reasonable conditions on my speech, for example, that I stick to some allotted time limit, or that I don't stray from the topic of free speech into, say, my opinions about the embarrassing self-inflicted wound of Brexit, or the disappointing and overhyped television program The Bodyguard. I have no right to demand that anyone in particular share this stage with me, nor do I have a right to hold the stage alone. although, of course, I could refuse an invitation to speak alongside anyone whose views I found offensive or with whom I didn't want to associate. And I have no right to demand that the university stifle any protest against my speech, although I note that I'm clearly not interesting enough to be protested, as long as that protest doesn't threaten my safety or interfere with my own ability to speak to you. Now, those may seem like obvious or even banal observations, but from time to time, controversy does seem to arise from misunderstandings over these basic limits of the right to free speech. For example, when particular academics or student groups refuse to share a stage with another invited speaker, that is not a violation of anyone's rights. But someone may want to tell that to the former Minister of Universities, Joe Johnson, MP. When students organize peaceful demonstrations protesting campus speakers, that is not a violation of anyone's free speech. And someone may want to remind that to Germaine Greer. Far from being violations of anyone's rights, those things are the exercise of fundamental free speech rights. But when any institution, even a student union, exercises the university's power to veto a speaker's invitation or to censor a speech that someone else on campus has arranged to hear, or when any group of people are left free to directly disrupt someone's act of speech, that is a free speech problem. Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights protects the right to freedom of speech, so I'm sure you know, and it includes a right to impart information, including the right to impart information or say things that offend the listener. And the Education Act of 1986 places upon universities a legal duty to secure freedom of speech for their students and for visiting speakers. So unless an event is going to result in a breach of the law, and that includes, by the way, the law against hate speech, a notion we might come back to later, universities and their agents should not interfere with efforts of members of the university community to facilitate any speech or the exchange of ideas. But this is Oxford and we're all intellectuals, so let's talk not just about what the law is, but maybe what the law should be. The argument is sometimes made that universities should prevent speech that degrades the equal dignity of particular groups of people. As the critical legal scholar Mary Matsuda, someone whom I admire greatly, argued, the notion of free speech begs the question of free for whom? The choice to allow offensive speech is a choice to burden the offended listener. And most often it is traditional victims of discrimination, a class of people who already have diminished access to power, including the power to have their voices heard, who bear the heaviest burden. When we ask women and Black people and gay people and transgender people and immigrants to recognize the free speech rights of those who would call them inferior or question their right to exist, we ask them to forego a potential tool of resistance in their own subjugation. And that is a lot to ask. And although we have been talking about what the law should be here, it's worth noting that the law does provide some support for this view. We've discussed that universities have a legal duty under the Education Act to facilitate free speech. But they also have under the Equalities Act what's known as the Public Sector Equalities Duty, which is the duty to, among other things, eliminate discrimination, harassment, and victimization, advance equality of opportunity, and foster good relations between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and persons who do not share it. One might argue that that duty includes an obligation to prevent speech that offends or degrades people of, using the statute's term, a relevant protected characteristic. And just for the sake of any university administration officials or general counsels in the room, I really don't envy you the job of balancing those quite seriously conflicting legal obligations. But shifting back again from the descriptive to the normative, my point fundamentally is this. Free speech advocates, of which I am a part of that group, are wrong if we deny that speech can cause harm. We would be wrong, and many people are wrong, to suggest that the marketplace of ideas is a level playing field where everyone participates freely and good ideas will certainly triumph over bad ones. The answer to bad speech is more speech, is something that people say often, and I think that's a completely unsatisfactory response to those who would criticize the notion of free speech. It's a shallow excuse, and it fails to acknowledge that not everyone has equal access to speech, and not everyone will be heard. Nevertheless, I think compromising principles of free speech on campus would be an enormous mistake, primarily for two reasons. The first reason is that shutting down speech is generally counterproductive. For example, amidst the turbulence of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, many American universities, including, again, the hero of our story, the University of California at Berkeley, began aggressively enforcing regulations limiting on-campus political activism for, quote, outside political causes. In the 1964 to 65 academic year, which was the year before Stokely Carmichael's speech, thousands of students responded to those new policies, or the new enforcement of those policies, by engaging in the largest mass act of civil disobedience ever seen on a campus. They illegally but peacefully occupied a campus building for days, and after a several-day-long standoff, police raided the building, arresting hundreds of students. The crackdown sparked national outrage. Celebrities flocked to the campus. The folk singer Joan Baez made a famous performance on the steps of that campus building, and arrested students became news celebrities, most notably Mario Savio, whose famous speech about the need to put your bodies upon the gears, upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus of the great dehumanizing machinery of power has inspired generations of activists ever since. The university had no choice but to back down, and the free speech movement, as that group of students came to be known, grew into a powerful nationwide anti-war movement that contributed to the end of the Vietnam War. Turning to a more recent and less inspiring example, after the dramatic cancellation of his speech last year, Milo Yiannopoulos, the villain of our story, vowed to return to Berkeley in triumphant fashion in September of 2017. He called his new event Free Speech Week, and in doing so, he deliberately co-opted the mantle of the free speech movement of Berkeley in the 1960s, even promising to issue an award for a prize for free speech called the Mario Savio Award, a proposal that Savio's surviving son called some kind of sick joke. This time, the university was better prepared, and they spent around $1 million in security, again, apologies to the administrators in the room, in order to enable Yiannopoulos' event to go forward without violence. This, it turns out, was a great disappointment to Mr. Yiannopoulos, whose business model required placing Berkeley in the role of villain, an enemy to his free speech champion. In the absence of any controversy, Yiannopoulos struggled to get any attention, and no one bought tickets. Invited speakers, including international archvillain Steve Bannon, dropped out, and Yiannopoulos folded, canceling the event, and he's been struggling to make a headline ever since then. Or to take an example somewhat closer to home, look at the story of Tommy Robinson, the avatar of a man named Stephen Christopher Yaxley, who founded the English Defense League, and whose public profile skyrocketed after he was charged with contempt for intentionally violating reporting restrictions on a criminal trial and succeeding in hoodwinking a large segment of the public into believing that he was prosecuted for exercising his right to free speech. If there's one lesson to take from all of these examples, it's that attempts to silence speech often inject oxygen into a movement and increase its power. And sadly, in recent times, the fascist right has been extremely effective in exploiting that dynamic. A second and far more important reason to question equality-based arguments for rolling back free speech on campus is that it's almost always counterproductive to the groups that we're trying to protect. The tools that we give universities to limit speech in the name of equality will be used to undermine equality. With all due respect to Oxford University, who again I'm very grateful for the invitation from, a university is an institution of power, and it's a bureaucracy. And any rule administered by a bureaucracy that allows censoring of speech creates the risk of the arbitrary exercise of power. All of us, students, professors, the people you would seek to invite onto campus, we move from a status of being free to a status of being censorable. And while universities are grounded in a noble mission to educate, they also have institutional corporate interests in preserving their brand, their revenue streams, and their relationships with political authorities. All of those dynamics create a significant risk of censorship of provocative people on the left, perhaps even more so than on the far right, including radical voices within traditionally marginalized communities. And this dynamic is not merely hypothetical. We've already heard the story of Stokely Carmichael and referenced the fact that in the 1970s, the ideas of a values-based attack on campus speech belonged to the far right. Ronald Reagan campaigned successfully throughout that decade on a promise to crack down on student dissidents and to close campuses to anti-war, pro-civil rights, and left-wing speakers. Free speech, he said, free speech does not require furnishing a podium to any speaker. He continued, "I don't think you should lend these people the prestige of our university campuses for the presentation of their views." And one wonders, that's a sentiment we hear so often today, that one wonders whether those who articulate it realize whose original work they're sampling. Or take university hate speech codes, which have been standard practice at universities in the UK and America since at least the 1990s. These codes emerged from the demands of women and other minority students to address issues of discrimination and exclusion on campus. But the data show that they are sometimes used against the very people they're designed to protect. Take, for example, my alma mater, my undergraduate alma mater, the University of Michigan. In less than 2 years under that university's speech code, more than 20 white students successfully accused black students of racist speech. In fact, had that code been in place at Berkeley in 1966, Stokely Carmichael's speech would have violated it. So the idea that progressive causes are vulnerable to campus censorship, that's a reality, and it's not merely a historical artifact. Apologies for the American examples, but you know how my people like to set the bar. Last year, a Princeton professor named Keeanga Yamada Taylor was forced to cancel a series of campus speeches after receiving death threats for criticizing Donald Trump. And unlike Milo Yiannopoulos, she did not receive sufficient assurances of safety from the universities where she was invited to speak. And the president of another American university last year apologized for allowing a black student to read a poem critical of police violence at commencement, calling it a mistake and promising greater oversight of the program at next year's event. Or how about an example much closer to home? I read with some concern a report that the Chancellor of Oxford, Chris Patten, criticized students involved in the campaign to remove a statue of Cecil Rhodes. He, according to the report I read, suggested that they should abandon their cause, or, and I'm quoting from The Guardian reporting on this here, think about being educated elsewhere. Ironically, Patten appears to have cloaked his implicit threat in the mantle of free speech, accusing students of trying to stifle debate by turning away from historical facts. With respect to the Chancellor, that's ridiculous. The students obviously weren't trying to stifle a debate, they were trying to start one. And they were rewarded with condemnation and something that smelled a little bit too much like the threat of punishment. Evidence for the critical value of free speech protections for vulnerable, disempowered, and pervasively discriminated against communities is omnipresent for those of us who work on the ground in free speech law. The Milo Yiannopouloses and the Tommy Robinses seeds the headlines, and there's much talk about the intentional weaponization of the free speech by the fascist right. But those of us who work on the ground know that the real victims of free speech violations most often are not far-right lunatics with PR consultants, but people who don't have power. They are victims of domestic violence whose abusive former partners use defamation claims to silence them when they publicly call out their abusers. They are black teenagers who have an injunction slapped on them, prohibiting them from making music videos because the police have drawn a spurious link between their style of music and violent crime. And they are citizens exercising the time-honored tradition of civil disobedience who are threatened with extra-long jail sentences because they refuse a judge's command to renounce their environmentalist views. All three of those examples come from Liberty's free speech work in the last 6 weeks alone. Our commitment to equality should not push us to limit free speech. In fact, our commitment to equality requires us to question the acceptability of rules that allow the gatekeepers of power to decide who has access to speaking platforms and on what terms. It's not possible to write rules to protect ourselves from racists, fascists, and transphobes that cannot be turned back and used against the next generation of activists for equality and justice. This is not an assertion that free speech is a higher value than equality. I don't believe that. If it were possible to achieve equality by sacrificing our right to say certain things, then in my opinion, that would be well worth it. But we will not eradicate racism, misogyny, transphobia, or any other evil by prohibiting or criminalizing speech. I said earlier that asking people who are already disempowered to accept others' right to speak in ways that perpetuate disempowerment is asking them to put down a tool of resistance. And I will admit that coming to peace with that is difficult. It remains, for me, a very uneasy peace. But I do take comfort in the fact that on the objective facts, it appears that university communities on the whole are handling this difficult and important issue rather well. You've no doubt seen tabloids and tabloidian politicians talking about a crisis of free speech on campus. and fretting about snowflakes and safe spaces and no platforming and other rather unhelpful rhetorical devices. But the evidence shows that there is no crisis of free speech on campus. Last year, Parliament's Joint Committee on Human Rights took extensive evidence on this issue from individual students, student organizations, academics, university administrators, some people in this room, and in the report issued in March found that contrary to all that media and ministerial hype, there is, and I quote, no pervasive problem with shutting down free speech on campus. And polling consistently shows that student attitudes toward free speech are fairly supportive, or at least in line with the general population, which undercuts the notion that free speech has some sort of generational problem. For example, when a group of 1,004 students and a group of the general public, 1,600 British adults, were questioned on whether they would want to disinvite speakers with certain controversial views from their real or imagined universities, there was, and I quote from the poll here, no evidence that students are more likely than the general public to want to ban speakers whose views they find offensive. In another poll, 83% of students reported feeling free in the main to, quote, express their opinions and political views openly and without any restriction on their campuses. And most students agree with statements like, quote, the best way to fight prejudice is to debate it rather than ban it. Not all, but the distribution isn't meaningfully different from the general population, and it seems to me, frankly, that there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of uncertainty about that sort of categorical statement. And only a small percentage of students, around 14% according to these polls, express any support for the notion that student unions should ban speakers that may cause offense to some students. As we've now thoroughly discussed, universities have always been battlegrounds for ideas about the balance between free speech and equality. Almost 50 years ago, the university intellectual Herbert Marcuse argued that free speech should become a form of oppression, and he criticized the notion of a free marketplace of ideas as absurd. And with Marcuse as an influence, and in direct response to the rise of fascist movements like the National Front, the National Union of Students adopted its first no-platform policy in 1974. Even I wasn't born then. And that policy vowed to ban any speaker who, quote, holds racist or fascist views. And even then, there was disagreement among NUS chapters all over the country about whether it should be limited to groups who expressly advocated violence and incitement, or whether it should be expanded to include those with more generally racist or far-right views, and whether it might not be more productive to expose the latter views to debate. All that is to say, we have been here before, and we will always be here as universities in this space grappling in good faith with these genuinely important questions and difficult questions of the balance between equality and free speech. Likewise, contemporary left-wing critiques of free speech as neglecting the implications for equality, these did not spring fully formed from some newly woke 21st century consciousness. In the 1980s, psychological studies of trauma and critical feminist and racist studies in the legal profession began to explore the concept that words can cause harm, a concept that fed the growth of campus hate speech codes in British and American universities throughout the early 1990s, and which again, at their inception, inspired heated debates about what kind and how much speech a campus should tolerate, and what the consequences should be for those whose speech harm other students. So when Joe Johnson or Spike.com or Donald Trump or Fox News engage in hand-wringing over the campus free speech crisis and suggest that academic freedom and the human capacity for critical thinking face extinction from a unique modern threat, when they insult students of this generation as snowflakes who can't endure intellectual challenge, we should not stand for that. That is an ignorant and ahistorical analysis. It's fake news. There is substantial irony in the government spuriously accusing students of threatening free speech when, in fact, the true threat to free speech, as it always does, comes from the government's own policies. Indeed, it's almost a Trumpian maneuver to distract from a series of government policies that deliberately set out to stifle debate and disempower the voices of people on campuses who may challenge government orthodoxy. Pursuant to the government's so-called prevent strategy for countering so-called radicalization, the government imposes obligations on universities and members of the university community that either directly interfere with free speech or have the foreseeable and actual effect of chilling the exercise of free expression. Section 26(1) of the Counterterrorism Security Act of 2015 imposes upon universities a duty to, quote, have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. Statutory guidance on this duty requires universities to check that speakers are not likely to express, and I quote, extremist views, and if they may express such views, to either take steps to limit the speech, or if they cannot limit that speech in order to manage the risk of extremist views, to cancel the event. What are extremist views? No one can really say for sure. The Home Office defines extremism as, and I'll quote here, the vocal or active opposition to our fundamental values, including the rule of law, individual liberty, and the mutual respect and tolerance for those of different faiths and beliefs. By that definition, I would have expected to see Katie Hopkins referred to Prevent long ago. And I wonder if the Home Secretary would consider his own defense of the recent decision to prioritize deference to Donald Trump's feelings over the rule of law on the UK's opposition to the death penalty to be extremist. Perhaps less hyperbolically, this definition of extremism, as Harriet Harman has noted, would classify as extremist her own feminist-grounded criticism of those who use religion to justify discrimination against women and LGBT people. This is simply not a coherent or workable definition of extremism, especially not for the purposes of judging whether we think someone is on the road to terrorist violence. Perhaps it's not surprising, then, that the government itself gets confused about what its definition is. Although I've read to you the definition that comes from the Home Office's website, at other times the government has defined extremism as any activity which creates an environment for radicalizing individuals that could lead them on a pathway to terrorism. Yet other times they say, extremism is wider than terrorism. It is a hate crime and the other harms that can be caused to society by the promotion of ideology that leads to harm. And it's worth noting that the Home Office's definition of extremism is different to the one used by the National Association of Chiefs of Police, which is different again to the one used by the National Domestic Extremism Unit of the Met. It should go without saying that incoherent attacks on speech and thought are dangerous to individual rights and to society. The Education Reform Act of 1998 says that academic staff should have the freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom and to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions. But it's harder to imagine a clearer example of received wisdom than our fundamental values, which is from the definition of the Home Office's definition of extremism. Is questioning those values the mark of a good professor or of an extremist? I recently debated the UK's fundamental value of parliamentary sovereignty with a legal academic, where I argued that it should be limited. Am I an extremist? Of course not. And of course, I also know that there's little reason to believe that I'll ever find myself caught up in the Prevent program. But that's because I have white privilege. There's every reason to believe that that black and brown students and academics, as well as those of Muslim faith, will be caught up in the Prevent program because they have been caught up in the Prevent program. And there's even more reason to know that the exercise of the right to freedom of speech, conscience, and association on campus has been compromised by the Prevent program. A recent research study based on a national survey of more than 2,000 students at UK universities and a qualitative research at 6 universities showed that many Muslim students modify their behavior as a result of Prevent by self-censoring or disengaging from campus life and their studies, for fear of being stigmatized, labeled an extremist, or subjected to other discrimination. That study also shows that Prevent has led to wariness among Muslim and non-Muslim students about participating in research about religion, freedom of speech, and campus life. During recent testimony before Parliament, the director of SOAS reported that there is a sense on our campus and among a lot of our students that they are operating in an environment where they feel under particular scrutiny, where as students who may be Muslim or come from ethnic minorities or have particular political views, they are under additional scrutiny as a result of that. Patrick Kilduff, who's the president of the Edinburgh University Students Association, said that a question and answer session with a Syrian refugee had been canceled over fears that they would have a negative impact on the organizers because of the Prevent rules. He concluded that the real threats to free speech are coming from government legislation like Prevent. And a woman named Helen Mansfield, QC, told Parliament that Prevent encourages universities to have an over-anxious approach to stopping speech for fear that it might be an indicator of a view that runs afoul of Prevent. Now, last year, in a case in court called Salman Butt versus Secretary of State for the Home Department, the courts narrowed the scope of the Prevent guidance, interpreting the duty to apply to speech only which actually creates a risk that others will be drawn into terrorism. And that's a good result. But patterns of behavior under PREVENT have already bedded in. The government, as far as I know, has done nothing to update the PREVENT guidance since that court decision, let alone anything to undo the misunderstanding and fear that its prior vague approach has sown into the fabric of campus life. And if anything, that court decision, in practical terms, only adds to the confusion in society on campuses by the multiplicity of definitions of extremism that float around in various government documents and guidance forms. For nearly half a decade, Liberty have been calling for an independent review of PREVENT. Its costs are clear, and its benefits, if any, are hidden behind the government's disregard for norms of transparency. The desire to interrupt the process of radicalization is a laudable one, but we cannot let that desire override the very liberties and values that many of today's terrorists seek to threaten. I want to close, and I'm going to close now, with a quote from the historian and journalist Jill Lepore, which I think throws into stark contrast the theme uniting this, which is the centrality of campuses and university life to the norm and values and legal protections of free speech. She said, "All speech is not equal. Some things are true, some things are not. And figuring out how to tell the difference is the work of the university, which rests on a commitment to freedom of inquiry, an unflinching search for truth, and the fearless unmasking of error. But the university has obligations, too, to freedom of speech, whose premise, however idealized, is that in a battle between truth and error, truth in an open field will always win. If the commitment to these difficult freedoms has sometimes flagged, and it has just as often been renewed. Free speech is not a week or a place. It is a long and strenuous argument, as maddening in the past and as painful as the truth." Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. That was a very interesting speech, and outed me as someone who invites people whose views I admire and think are worth a platform, but there we are. Hang on, I'm not sure I've got my microphone, so can't be heard. Yes, there we are. Yes. So I think those are very interesting observations. I wondered, though, if you thought if there are some views that are beyond free speech and some views which the state ought, in protection of other fundamental values, whatever they may be, ought to ban even on campus.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly speech that is unprotected as free speech. Threats are speech but are not protected. And in this country, hate crime is a speech, and we define hate crime as speech that tends to incite hatred, whether it's racial and religious hatred or hatred based on sexual orientation or religious intolerance. I think, we could have a debate about hate speech because I think those laws may go a little bit too far. But certainly, I think the straight answer to your question is yes, there are. And where we draw the line is a values-based argument. You also can't incite imminent lawless action, and all those examples are speech that causes such direct harm that as a society we think we should prioritize the ability to punish that speech in order to achieve some goal that we think is more important. And that's really the essence of the debate, and more generally about equality. And when we think about hate speech laws, and when we think about extending beyond even just the incitement of racial or religious hatred or the definition of hate speech to speech that more broadly denigrates other people, it is fundamentally a weighing of values. And in weighing those values, you have to think not only just about is the value of equality or the value being served greater than the value of free speech, but also will it accomplish those goals? It's just a traditional human rights law framework. Is it necessary? Is it proportionate? And for each of those, I think the law has engaged in analysis and taken some categories of speech and said this goes too far.
Yeah. I guess I'm interested just because I know there are different attitudes to free speech in the United States and in Britain, so or in Europe, I think more widely. And I just wondered if you felt that the boundaries in UK law are about right, or if you think, after all, there are other jurisdictions where denying the Holocaust is unlawful. It's not unlawful in this country to say that. And
many people here think that goes too far. Maybe it's a question of context. But I just wondered if you, kind of coming from the outside in a very different free speech tradition, felt that we got it right or go too far?
Yeah, so I think the answer, I first want to start by saying I do think the question depends on the context. And I think whether speech should be criminalized does depend on national history and can be different in different places because of histories of violence or subjugation or repression. For example, there may well be reasons why certain speech, given certain countries' histories, may have a different significance that might make it the right decision to go farther. But to answer your question directly, I mean, speaking personally, I'm quite skeptical of the UK's hate speech law. I mean, just in general, I don't think we've seen any evidence that the criminalization of speech has been successful in eradicating is too high a standard. I don't hold it to that standard, but even diminishing the prevalence of the views that it's designed to target. It's true that criminalization is a very cheap and easy way for society to express condemnation of speech. And it's also true that it's important for society and its leaders to condemn views that should be condemned. But to criminalize speech is, fundamentally, I think, quite a lazy approach to that problem, because we do not win debates by locking people up in jail. In fact, what we tend to do more often than not is create martyrs. Take, for example, one of the worst free speech headline stories of last year, which was the Nazi dog. I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was this ridiculous man who had this ridiculous dog, and he trained his dog to do a Nazi salute when he said an offensive thing about Jews. And it's disgusting. And he was prosecuted and convicted under the hate crime statute. And I think under the hate crime statute, it's probably a valid conviction. And all that happened was he was a cause celeb. He on Crowd Justice, our crowdfunding website, he raised almost £200,000 to support his legal defense, which won't cost, and now I'm sure he's just going to pocket the money. So we've made a Nazi richer, and he's got a great lawyer to reduce his sentence, and maybe he'll serve some of his sentence, and maybe he won't. But even if he does, he'll come out and go probably have a great rally with Tommy Robinson. And in the end, you just have to wonder, what was that for? And so I think on a cost-benefit analysis, when we think about, are we accomplishing the goal of expressing societal condemnation in a way that's going to reduce the prevalence of these views and the harm that these views do cause to people, I just don't think that criminalization is the answer. And I'm also just inherently skeptical of the idea that criminal sentences, that the carceral solutions are the right approach to solving social problems.
Yeah. The other thing that you said that I was very interested in is the idea that in the end, the biggest threat to free speech comes from the state. And the state imposing legislation like the Counter-Terrorism Act, which then has codes of practice attached to it, which effectively give the state power to say what is and isn't in our speech that reflects our fundamental values. And I wondered whether you thought that there was sometimes a role for the state, or even a positive duty on the state to protect free speech. And I wondered whether you were, what your views were on the 1986 Education Act, because the reason I think about that question is, you started off by saying there's no right to speak. You don't have to invite someone if you find them offensive. You don't have to share a platform. How far? I think there may be some potential for the Education Act to be interpreted by the Office for Students, which is the new regulator of universities, to say, well, you need a kind of BBC model, and if you're going to have Corrie Stoughton here expressing this view on free speech, we need someone else here to say, no, there are things that are completely beyond the pale, and someone else who says there should be no criminal legislation at all, and it has to be kind of like question time, and we have a duty, and I know that some universities have kind of interpreted it like that we have a duty to make sure panels are balanced. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I'm quite skeptical of that idea, in part because it assumes that you can effectively decide what balance looks like. And in that model, you ascribe the power to decide what good balance is to the state. And again, I think I'm quite skeptical that I trust the state to say, okay, take any issue, whether it's free speech or Brexit or really any issue you can come up with, and how do I assemble a range of views that represent the right range of opinions on this. And that's giving onto the state an enormous amount of power to define not only a viewpoint, but what is the range of acceptable viewpoints on a topic. And I think that's actually extremely dangerous.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, I've had my chance, I think. I'm going to open it up because there's also a power to have a range of views. Has anyone else got something? Yes, Chris.
No, I'm a visitor here.
Okay, sorry, just wait for the...
Thanks, and thanks very much for the terrific talk. I wanted to actually ask you about the other half of the title, which is not so much focused on what is and isn't free speech, but what is and isn't a university. I couldn't tell how much your argument depends on universities at all, or whether it would be the same for an internet platform. As Twitter, for example, starts trying to figure out what speech it's going to stop, and most recently proposed for public comment that that dehumanizing another would cross the bar, and they would block that speech. Are your arguments about what a university can and can't do different from what you would argue that an internet platform can and can't do? And what do we do about the fact that universities and internet platforms are merging? That the internet platforms are the vehicles through which a huge amount of on-campus speech is carried out, and that university education globally is moving essentially onto the internet anyway and out of classrooms, with classes of 400,000 people on Coursera and other educational platforms. So it's really a question about the status of the university in your argument, and whether anything you just said actually depends on the university as the object versus, say, an internet platform.
Yeah, I mean, I think my instinct is to say that a lot of my argument depended on it being the university, and when I thought about that, because to kind of, I'll get back to the internet part, I won't forget that part, but one of the things I think I really grapple with is that I do, and I didn't mention this, but I do think we have to take seriously the argument that the regulation of speech on university campuses might be different from a public square, just to go back to the old kind of traditional space. Because, and it depends a little bit on what you think a university is for, but, if your vision of a university is that a university is simply just a place for the free exchange of ideas, which a little bit came out in the Jill Lepore quote at the end, which is something that resonates with me about my idea of what a university is, then I think you just think, universities should be just kind of plain, free speech should be everywhere. But that doesn't strike me as quite an accurate description of what a university is. I mean, without being condescending to students, universities are a place where most human beings are in a process of transitioning from childhood into the real world. And university, you kind of have one foot in the real world and one foot in the world as it should be. And that also seems right, and especially now that I'm a parent and less farther away from being a university student, it might start to seem more right. And so for example, in things like campus speech codes and when will a university interfere with speech that students are directing at each other, I can see an argument, although I struggle with this, that maybe there should be more leeway for a university to take action. I think you have to think about what the right action is appropriate, but to take action when speech would fall within the realm of what we would call, protected speech that's protected by free speech principles. And likewise, with internet platforms, there's quite persuasive arguments that internet platforms are not the public square, that these are corporations who are establishing a framework that themselves have responsibilities, much in the way that a university has a responsibility to students, although I think universities have probably greater responsibility to students than an internet platform has to its users, but nonetheless some responsibility to ensure that people are not degraded and abused on their platforms. And that's different from a public square. What I'm really going to start to get to, though, is that I don't know the answer to the question about internet platforms, even less so how that's emerging with universities and what the implications of those are. I think it's one of the most important questions that we have, and we've been discussing a lot within Liberty and really struggle to come up with an answer. One of the reasons, I think, is that it also gets into an area that as human rights advocates we feel a little bit at sea on, which is the notion of whether internet provider platforms ought to be regulated by the government as a public utility or a public accommodation, much more rather than just simply as corporate entities, because they are so much in control of channels of communication. And I'm not sure if that's the answer, but in any case, I think both of these examples show that our different ways of communication, our different modes of communication are really putting traditional notions of free speech under stress. And even as a strong advocate of free speech, I'm not an free speech absolutist in the sense that I think, again, going back to the very beginning when we sat down, we have to remember the values we're trying to protect for free speech and acknowledge that there may be other values that are more important. And if we think that we need to compromise our free speech principles because we can effectively address some other more important value, which includes values of equality and inclusion and fairness, then we have to take those proposals seriously. That's not a very good answer to your question, Chris, I'm sorry, but it's quite a good question.
It's what we like in a university. Yes, got a hand here. If you can just wait for the microphone, then thank you.
Thank you. John Waller, a visiting historian. You started off your talk by giving some good arguments as to why it would be a fine thing to have fewer people coming to universities presenting divisive falsehoods, and then gave a number of practical arguments why that's a good thing. But in terms of how to achieve it, bans will often be counterproductive. In particular, it gives oxygen to people like Milo. Now, clearly, that's a relatively easy thing to study empirically. You can show the counterproductive effects of silencing people. But there's another aspect of this that I think one may have to study, and that's the number of potentially dangerous demagogues, ideologues who, because of the fear of bans, because of the fear of the sanctions, largely keep their ideas to themselves, don't influence as many other people, don't make it seem okay, and as a result cause less harm. So how does one go about finding out how many people are quite helpfully kept quiet because of these sorts of controversies, even when they do explode and give oxygen to people like Milo, for every person like Milo who actually benefits from it?
Well, I don't think you can measure that, but I'm also skeptical that really happens. I mean, what you're suggesting is that the controversy, that people who want to avoid the kind of spotlight that was shown on Milo then just kind of stay home because we've made it quite difficult for them to speak, and that's a good thing.
Yes, or people simply would feel that these ideas are simply too risky, they're too unacceptable, change their ideas, or at least don't broadcast them as widely.
But let's break down that idea. I mean, for someone to conclude that where their ideas are too risky or unacceptable is a very different thing from saying that they were persuaded that they were bad ideas. And I think, in a utopian and ideal world, we don't want people to just kind of say, well, I'm going to sit at home and hold my abhorrent thoughts. In reality, that person can't just sit at home. They will go out into the world and have those thoughts and inevitably act on them, whether it's in running a business that will discriminate against people or engaging in behavior that's discriminatory in one-to-one interactions in society. That's not a world we want to be in. So I think kind of the idea of driving people to stay at home with their abhorrent views is not a worthy goal. And that's far different from then the notion that making abhorrent speech more difficult is actually going to persuade anybody with those views that they should change those views and question them. And I don't really see how that could happen. I mean, I recognize that it's not always the case that a debate will also result in anyone changing their mind, and certainly not debates online, especially, lately, my experience with debating the Gender Recognition Act challenges, but quite underscored how difficult it is to have a civil conversation about something and persuade one another online, and how quickly it degenerates. But we're certainly not going to get that way simply by making people stay at home and be too afraid to talk to one another. I mean, whatever the way forward is, I think it's not that.
Just to be devil's advocate on that, if we start off and we say we want to protect our fundamental values, and I debate what that is, but we say the fundamental values are a plural, tolerant society where people can speak and they can receive and impart ideas. If you shut down a platform for certain kinds of hatred, you may change the way people in society think and in favour of the fundamental values. And I'm just as an example that after the Brexit referendum and attacks on human rights in general, there's much more hate speech. That is empirically measurable, yeah. And it's harder to be someone who's the victim of that. It results in acts. There's also much more hate crime.
Yeah, and remember, it's not a free speech problem to not give someone a platform. Yourself it's not a free speech platform to never invite Milo Yiannopoulos to university. And I think it's quite right that institutions should think about what kind of views they want to promote and use their platforms in that way. And that kind of gets back to the question about the internet. It's quite right if you put aside the kind of monopoly problems about monopolizing kind of means of communication, it's quite right for internet service providers to be thinking about their responsibility for perpetuating views, whether it's Alex Jones or whatever the case may be. And I don't think that's a free speech problem. And I think I agree with you that you're quite right that if you can succeed in taking oxygen out of a movement by simply not creating controversy and not lending power and voice to it, then that's fine. But it's not a coincidence that where rights get triggered are where controversy happens, and so I think it's kind of an elegant connection between the fact that where our free speech rights actually come into play are where you're most likely to feed oxygen into a movement, because there's inherently conflict there, because there is a presumption of a right, because someone has extended an invitation to a campus speaker, and now a powerful institution is going to come in and say, no, you can't do that. There's a conflict there because there's a right involved now. And that conflict generates the oxygen that feeds the movement. Whereas if you took it back to where there isn't a free speech right, and we just thought, as a university, we're never going to invite, X or Y person with X or Y view to speak, or as a student organization, we're not really in the business of kind of promoting people, like, for example, I understand the National Union of Students they call it a no platform policy, which gets them into trouble. But all they're just saying is we are, as a union of students, not going to extend invitations to people with, these racist and fascist views. That's fine. They can do that because that's a privilege that they control, not a right that they're taking away from someone.
Thank you. I have somebody here.
Thank you. Thanks. My name's Nick Hillman. I run a higher education think tank based here in Oxford, and in fact we did some of the research for the Joint Committee on Human Rights investigation into this. Thank you very much for your speech. It was absolutely fascinating, and particularly I think the transatlantic points made me think. But I wondered if I could push back in two ways, because it seemed to me a tiny bit complacent, if I may say so, in one respect. So I worked for 12 years for one of Joe Johnson's predecessors as university's minister, David Willetts. And he was banned from speaking on university campuses. So when you say Joe Johnson's discovered a fake problem, I'm not quite sure that's true. So, for example, when I worked for David Willett, he was shouted down and unable to get his words out at an event at Cambridge. Birkbeck cancelled a lecture he was due to give. And on other occasions, we had to cancel events because the police couldn't guarantee the minister's security. So I'm not completely confident that Joe Johnson was looking at a fake problem rather than a real one. And the second thing I'd like to push back on a little bit is some of the data you quoted on students' opinions on free speech issues is actually our data, my organisation's data. And the key thing that I learned from that study when we went out and we asked students a bunch of questions, which amazingly no one had ever asked students before, like what do you actually think of the NUS no platform policy and other things, we found students said yes to almost everything. So if you said to them, do you love free speech? Do you think free speech should be entirely protected on campus? They said yes, and you got the high figures, and you mentioned one of them. If you then said, do you think tabloid newspapers should be banned from student union shops? You also got a yes. If you said, do you support no platform? Yes, a lot of students like that. Do you like the prevent policies? A significant number of students like say in a survey they're quite relaxed about some of the prevent measures. More than a quarter of students want UKIP entirely banned from all British university campuses. And we did this survey just before the Brexit vote. So, you know, it suggested to me they were trying to keep off campus a significant portion of British public opinion, which perhaps needed to be heard on campus. So my question, because after that survey, my conclusion was just students are deeply confused about these issues, actually. And so my question is, do universities have a duty to help students through the thicket? Because I think when they arrive at university, and many students are young, as you said, only just left school, they just haven't thought very deeply about these issues. And do you think universities have a duty, alongside teaching the discipline the students enrolled on, to help students think through these issues more deeply than they do?
And I suppose that's partly about the second part of the European Convention on Human Rights, which isn't just a right to impart ideas, but also to receive them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to start, I don't mean to deny that there are any instances where free speech violations have happened on campus. I mean, there are some examples that has happened, and you obviously directly experienced some of them. But I think when you look at when the committee examined the range of evidence, and when you look at it especially against the history of the fact that this kind of stuff has been going on for basically all of our lifetimes, all I mean to suggest is that there's no new crisis here. And it's not to say there's not a problem. In fact, I think my point is really that campuses have always been the place where these battles happen, and we continually have to work through them. And so to jump to kind of the last part of your question, I completely agree that universities have an obligation to help students through and to facilitate conversations about that. But I would also add, I think that universities have an obligation to listen to students. And I think maybe the data we were looking at is different, because the poll I was citing is one that didn't use kind of yes/no questions, but rather had the kind of strongly disagree/agree ratio, and tended to ask, and so I think that data suggested actually that students do have quite coherent views about this, but I'm sure not all, but conflicting views. I mean, 83% supported free speech. That means 70% didn't. And so obviously there are students who have different views on campus, and I think universities should listen to students and what their experience can show about where the right line needs to be drawn in their view for protecting their own speech, but also their own, their dignity and the dignity of the students around them. And universities should be helping students, exactly as you say, to think about these issues and think about why do we have free speech, and what are the competing values associated with it. And one thing I think that's really critical, though, is that when we have that discussion, that we don't fall into the trap of just saying, well, it's free speech, so we can't talk about it. I mean, I think one of the most important things I wanted to say today is I think sometimes when we talk about free speech, and Americans are much worse at this than British people, I will confess, we tend to just say, well, it's free speech, so we can't touch it. We can't. We treat it like it's an absolute right, when it's very clearly not an absolute right under the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's also not an absolute right in the American constitutional system. And as a university engaging in that kind of discussion that you were mentioning, it would be irresponsible for us not to ask students to look behind that right and to figure out, what are we trying to get at here? What are we protecting? And if we oppose free speech, or we want a limit on free speech, what value are we trying to advance with that, and will it be effective in achieving that goal? And if we don't take students through that kind of rigorous ability to identify the competing values at stake and balance them and do it from a historically informed perspective, then I think we're really doing a disservice to campus free speech and to free speech off campus.
Thank you. Paul.
Hello, thank you very much for that talk. I'm Paul Flather, I'm attached to Mansfield, but I've also had the privilege of running a club of European universities for about 17 years. And what we did was to try to pick up on controversial issues that affected Europe and have debates involving students. So the issue of migration was obviously a crucial one. And I just wanted to talk you through a kind of free speech crisis that I had to, that arose and that I had to manage. And I'd like your sort of comment on it. Before I say that, let me say that I find myself in agreement with where you concluded, though I agree it's a terribly complicated set of issues. So I decided that there should be a discussion on whether politicians were hindering or aiding the debate on migration in Europe. And I wanted a right-wing and a left-wing politician, plus others, to give balance. And I invited Norbert Hofer, who was the right-wing presidential candidate in Austria. He only lost by a whisker. And the event was going to be in Geneva, which is a society made up of many migrants. It was at a top university institute there. And we had the foreign minister from Prague, Schwarzenberg, who's very liberal. So we had the two, if you like, BBC balances. We also invited the deputy from the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and we had a fourth speaker who was the actually president of the European Commission, Barroso. So that was our panel, and there were going to be 800 students there. But a week before, 100 students marched up to the director and said they were going to ambush the event, prevent anyone coming in, call students from all around to ban it because they didn't want to have a neo-fascist, anti-migrant speaker in the campus. So we actually met with them over 3 days and tried to negotiate in order to allow the event to take place and the free speech to happen. And we also thought it would be very harmful for the institution to have to ban it. And the compromise was that we allowed a chosen student speaker to speak immediately after the presentation from Mr. Hofer, that they would obviously be allowed to protest outside as well as inside. And the protest in the inside would take place where they could hold up banners. Obviously, we would call people from the floor, so we didn't know who would speak. But something like 200 of the 800 speakers held up banners protesting this person's views. And we had 2 or 3 students, and I was worried that it would go on and on. We had 3 attacking students as our first 3 speakers. But in the end, we had quite a decent 1 hour plus discussion after the 1 hour presentation. And we had the range of views. I mean, it was electric in the atmosphere, was just, and it turned out to be a very good event and got huge numbers of people talking. Obviously, it was covered all over the media and also in many European countries. So I think one should err on allowing speech to happen, but as we've discussed, balance it in different ways, and that's an example of how we did it. I suppose my question is, I mean, universities are democratic societies, so if the university, within a kind of democratic framework, decided not to have a speaker, where would you stand on that?
Well, first of all, congratulations on handling a free speech crisis in what sounds like an incredible way, with an incredible result. So the question is, what if a university if you had decided never to invite the Hungarian right-wing politician, is that a free speech problem?
Well, it's not directly related to my example, but I mean, universities are democratic societies. So if the students hold a poll democratically and decide not to have a particular speaker invited, who's been invited or disinvited or cancelled, how would you react to that kind of situation? Or if the academics did it?
Yeah, I mean, I think both my opinion and the law is that if an institution within the university is exercising power that's granted to it by the university, even in a democratically run system, to veto the ability of other members of that university community to invite and listen to and access the ideas of any speaker, as long as that speaker's speech doesn't violate the law, then that violates the law, and that is a free speech problem. I mean, if it was the university administration doing it, I think that we wouldn't even be asking the question, right? But it's that kind of, when you add in that democratic process to it, I don't think that makes a difference, because the purpose of human rights is that they belong to individuals, and that and that they are at some level above democratic interference. That we don't think, I mean, that they should be subjected to a plebiscite, and then suddenly we shouldn't have the right to free speech. And in fact, because if that were the case, then unpopular views would never be heard. So I think I think at the end, by whatever means it's done, if the university or an entity exercising the university's power to say what ideas can and can't be heard over the desires that people within the university community hear it, then that's a free speech problem.
Yes, we've got one here. Please could you just wait with the microphone? I know people are just coming down. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Meghna, and I'm a visiting student from a Midwestern American liberal arts college.
Well, which one? Because I'm from Michigan, so now you have to tell me.
My college is in Ohio. It's Kenyon College.
Kenyon College, all right.
Yeah. I thought your talk was really interesting. I'm actually from India, so I've been studying abroad in the US, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about administrative overreach. As an Indian, I understand the skepticism about the state. India has been clamping down pretty heavily on anti-Hindu sentiments as an excuse to prosecute minorities. But at the same time, what I kind of see in the United States right now is that each of these universities are essentially their own little jurisdictions. And depending on sort of the political affiliation of them, you have small liberal arts colleges, which tend to be literally more liberal, and large public universities, which have to, depending on the kind of state they're in, have to bow down to the pressures of that particular governor or the little Congress that there is. So I was just wondering, is it really a good idea to then hand over so much power to the universities in the United States, considering the situation right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I share with you that, I mean, the inherent skepticism of power that runs as a theme through your question, and really that notion of the fear of the exercise of power, whether to perpetuate that power or even in an arbitrary way, is one of the critical underlying themes of why free speech is so important. Because, again, it goes back to that idea. For me, these issues and so much about free speech is really a struggle between, the reality that so much speech, especially in America today, but also in the UK, you're talking about the rise in hate crimes after Brexit, is hateful and is causing harm, and why I keep coming back again and again to not wanting to let go of faith in the notion of free speech is fundamentally that fear of administrative overreach that you talked about, in that fear that the tools that we give to institutions to censor speech, to protect us from hate and to protect communities from further degradation and discrimination, will be used in a way that will be nefarious, or even if not nefarious, just arbitrary, in the way that kind of just power tends to do. So I think you quite rightly hit on, in some ways, what is the heart of the best argument for free speech protections, notwithstanding, the very real cost that we see all around us in our country of allowing things like, marches of Nazis, and just the terror, the speech, and hate speech after Brexit, and why ultimately giving the state more power to crack down on that is dangerous.
I have a question about prevent, and I say this. I say this because the JCR and the MCR in this college are very concerned that the college does not over-comply, doesn't gold plate. It has a statutory duty to comply with prevent, and our fundamental values, if we're talking about the quasi-constitution such as it is, would include the value of free speech. So I wondered, there was an article recently in the London Review of Books, well, not that recently, maybe last year, by Carmen Aguilsi, who's a political scientist here at St Edmund Hall, giving an example of a university she didn't name, so I don't know where it was, which had refused at Freshers' Fair the British Pakistani Students Association the right to have a stall, because they'd asked them to say who would be at the stall and whether they would be expressing extreme views, and they said, we don't know, it's Freshers' Fair, we can't say, and were refused the right to hold the stall, which is clearly, suppressing a particular kind of speech in the name of our fundamental values. I wonder what you think universities can do, because, as you say, you pity the administrators who are going to get it in the neck if they don't do this, and the Office for Students comes down on them, or if there's violence. So you can see why they take a precautionary approach. what do you think we as universities can do to comply with the law while not undermining our fundamental value of free speech?
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate answer to that is I don't know, because I have to say, when I first read the Joint Committee on Human Rights' report on campus free speech, I mean, the one thing I felt overwhelmingly when I read that is that I never want to become a university administrator.
Yeah.
I had not appreciated.
Thanks.
I had not appreciated. I mean, you know, Liberty submitted to that, and we talked about prevent, and of course, you know, these general principles of free speech. I've been a free speech lawyer for 15 years, but of course, I didn't have any idea the vast regulatory regime and conflicting regulatory requirements that are imposed upon universities here. And the truth is, I don't know how you make sense of them, and I think that's. I mean, it must be enormously frustrating. But the one thing that I would say is, and I think, you know, there are many universities, and I have no doubt that Oxford is one of them, that are doing it this way. I mean, you suggested as much, is that universities are recognizing their obligation to students and to principles of human rights to push back and to not be overly risk averse if that risk aversion would result in the infringement of especially of students' rights to free speech. So I read that article too, and it had many examples in it that were troubling. And what I can only hope is that those are relatively isolated. And the fact that they exist really underscores the dangers of programs and the risks, and the fact that when human rights groups like Liberty or university administrators stand up and say, you know, this is a problem, we were right, that it will be a problem. But universities can avoid that. And if the government comes at universities for that, I think in a way that it will be, under all the circumstances, a good thing, because it will force a debate about where Parliament and we as a society in this country have decided to draw the line. And better that those fights happen between universities and the government than between you know, the traditional victims of violations of free speech, which are, you know, Pakistani student associations and black and brown people and Muslims who don't have the resources to make that a fair fight and to turn that fight into an opportunity for people to have a learning moment and a check-in moment and to think, oh, you know, have we overdone it when it comes to imposing requirements on universities to police speech in the name of preventing radicalization and extremism, and should we start to think about restoring a greater cushion for the expression of ideas, even if there's a risk that they might tend into what a Home Office official might call extremism. So I guess I mean, it's easy for me to say this because I don't have to take the risk, but I would urge university administration officials to take that risk in the defense of rights. And I would appreciate the role they take in using their power to force those conversations.
Thank you. I think this has been a very interesting debate, and it's one that makes me feel very privileged, even as an administrator, to be in a university. It came to mind when Corey was speaking just now, and Paul was telling his free speech story of one from a very long time ago when I was a student, an undergraduate at this university, and Matt D'Ancona, who then went on to work for Article 19, a free speech organisation, and is now a journalist who writes about fake news and fundamental values of British society, ran something that was intended to be a kind of cheap and more inclusive version of the Union. And he started by inviting the South African ambassador to speak at a time when a lot of us were protesting apartheid, and South Africa was an apartheid society. And a very good friend of mine was the chair of the Oxford University Anti-Apartheid Society. So she said this, it was fundamentally wrong that this person had been invited to speak on our premises. It shouldn't happen. There would be a protest, and it was something where people fell out, and it was very divisive. So I went on the protest outside to say that I disapproved of apartheid, and then I went in. And the ambassador gave a pretty plausible sounding speech about how people were moving towards equality in South Africa, and we should give them time, and spending on black and white schools was becoming vaguely tiny bit more equal, and everyone should give time. It sounded sort of gradualist and plausible. And then two Rhodes scholars, in the name of Cecil Rhodes, but two Rhodes scholars basically took it apart. And one of them was Michael Barr, who went on to work at the Justice Department as well, and under Barber. And the other one was Kumi Naidu, who's now the General Counsel of Amnesty International. And they knew so much
about exactly what was happening in South Africa and asked such pertinent questions that in the end the ambassador lost his temper and asked the security man to remove Kumi Naidoo, who was then a refugee, a political refugee in the United Kingdom. And it was an incredible example of free speech in action, and I have ever since thought that on the whole you let people speak and you let them hang themselves, not literally, but you learn. I think in this environment it's incredible and an incredible privilege to share ideas. So thank you very much, Corey, because I've really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you.